When I saw my boyfriend standing in the hallway, holding the photo frame that had been face down on my nightstand for weeks, my breath caught in my throat, not because of the picture itself, but because of what was hidden behind it. The folded page. The one I thought I had destroyed months ago. I watched him unfold it slowly, his eyes scanning the handwriting he didn't recognize, every line pulling him further away from me, word by word. I took a step forward, my voice stuck somewhere deep in my chest. His hands were trembling as he read. I could see it from across the room. And I knew he was finally reading the truth. But only part of it. Only the part one couldn't bear to throw away. His brow furrowed when he reached the last line, and I knew exactly which one it was. It was the sentence that never should have been written, the one where I called another man home. A notification buzzed on his phone before I could say anything, and he glanced down. His expression changed in an instant. Pale. Blank. Like he couldn't breathe. The name on the screen had confirmed everything. His silence filled the entire room. I bit the inside of my cheek, trying not to panic, but it was too late. I had ruined everything. Not just the relationship, the stability, the safety, the image we had spent years crafting. It all came crashing down in those few seconds. Because 3 months ago, I made a choice I can never undo. A choice that pulled me into something far deeper than I ever imagined. And now I have to tell you everything. Before the version in his hands becomes the only one that ever mattered. But before I tell you the story I've been hiding, the one that started with a glance and ended with a storm, tell me in the comments where you're watching this from, and answer this: have you ever kept a secret that you knew would destroy everything if it ever came to light? I never wanted to go on that trip. That's the truth, as much as I wish it wasn't. When my mother suggested the idea, a family getaway to some remote part of Sedona, just the 4 of us, I smiled politely and nodded. But inside, I was already suffocating. I hadn't taken a real breath in months. Things with my boyfriend had been eroding for a while, in quiet ways that didn't show up in arguments or accusations, but in silences. In the way we stopped reaching for each other in the dark. In the way he asked how my day was, but never waited for the answer. We arrived at the house mid-afternoon. The sun was unforgiving, casting sharp lines across the red rocks that surrounded the rental like it had been carved into the land. The house itself was beautiful, all glass and stone and wide open space, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was a cage, just a prettier one. My mother was already talking about plans, grocery lists, hikes she'd read about online. Her voice was light, hopeful. She wanted this to be something healing. I could feel it. She believed that being far away from everything would bring us closer. My boyfriend, of course, was already glued to his phone, mumbling something about spotty Wi-Fi. I watched him from the edge of the living room as he turned his back to all of us. It wasn't malicious. Just typical. I felt that familiar weight settle in my chest, the one that reminded me how alone I could feel even when surrounded by people who loved me. Then he walked in. My mother's husband, my stepfather, technically, though I never used the word. He carried 2 suitcases effortlessly and smiled when our eyes met. I hadn't seen him in a while. Not really. There were holidays, sure, and birthday calls, but never like this. Never under one roof for this long. He looked older, but in a way that suited him. Gray at the temples, a little slower in his movements. But he carried himself the way some men do when they've figured things out, not with arrogance, but with quiet assurance. The kind that fills a room without speaking. The first night was uneventful. My mother made dinner, and we sat outside under string lights she insisted on bringing from home. My boyfriend scrolled through his feed while pretending to listen. My mother talked about hiking trails and healing crystals. And he just sat across from me, listening. Occasionally his eyes would flick toward me, just for a moment too long. Not in a way that was inappropriate. Not then. Just aware. That's the only word I can use. Later, when the dishes were cleared and everyone had gone to bed, I stayed outside. The air was warm but still, like the world was holding its breath. I heard the sliding door open behind me and turned to see him stepping out, barefoot, holding a glass of water. "You okay?" he asked, voice low. I nodded. "Just couldn't sleep." He joined me at the railing. We stood in silence for a long time, staring out into the dark desert. No city lights. No traffic. Just the occasional call of something wild in the distance. "You've changed," he said after a while. I glanced at him, surprised. "Is that a good thing?" He didn't look at me when he answered. "That depends on what changed." I didn't respond. Couldn't. My mind was a mess of things I didn't know how to say. The next morning, I woke early. The house was silent. I moved through it like a ghost, careful not to wake anyone. In the kitchen, I found him already awake, making coffee. He smiled when he saw me. A different kind of smile than the night before. Or maybe I imagined that. We sat on the back patio, watching the sun rise. My boyfriend eventually joined, but stayed glued to his phone, headphones in. My mother slept in late. The day stretched ahead of us like a long, quiet road, and for the first time since we arrived, I felt something shift. We spent the afternoon unpacking. Small talk filled the space. My mother wanted to make a grocery run, my boyfriend declined to come. I volunteered. He came with me. The car ride was short, but loaded with something unspoken. He told me about his new project, some restoration work on a property in New Mexico. I listened more than I spoke. I didn't know what I was looking for, exactly, but I was sure I'd recognize it when it came. Later that night, I found myself standing in front of the bathroom mirror, brushing my hair slower than usual. I kept thinking about the way he looked at me across the table. How his smile seemed to shift depending on who was watching. And how, when no one was around, he didn't smile at all. There was a knock at the door. My boyfriend, asking if I was done. I mumbled something and let him in. I didn't sleep that night. Not really. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the flicker of something I wasn't supposed to feel. And still, I didn't stop it. I let it sit there, just beneath the surface, waiting. Because I knew, somehow, this trip wouldn't end the way it started. Not for any of us. The day after our arrival began with stillness. The kind that settles not just in a room, but in your chest. Morning light poured through the high windows, casting soft gold onto the stone floor. I moved quietly, trying not to wake anyone as I made my way to the kitchen. The silence felt intentional, like it had something to tell me if I just stood still long enough to listen. He was already there. Sitting at the small round table near the window, reading something on his tablet, coffee in hand. He didn't look up right away, but when he did, there was something in his expression that stopped me. Not surprise. Not awkwardness. Just recognition. Like we had both arrived at the same thought at the same time, and neither of us knew what to do with it. I poured myself some coffee and took the seat across from him. My eyes flicked to the doorway, half expecting someone else to walk in. But we were alone. The thought didn't scare me. It should have. But it didn't. We talked about nothing. The weather. How quiet it was here compared to the city. He asked if I liked the house, and I said yes, though I wasn't sure it was true. It felt too exposed, too open. Like every glance, every shift in posture, was under a spotlight. Like silence wasn't empty but watching. At some point, my mother appeared, wrapped in a robe, sleepy but content. She kissed him on the cheek, smiled at me, and started making plans for the day, a trip into town, a hike later in the week, maybe dinner on the patio. Her voice filled the room the way only hers could, warm, fast, a little too loud. She didn't notice anything. That was her way. See what she wanted. Ignore what she didn't. My boyfriend stumbled in half an hour later, yawning, asking about the Wi-Fi password again, as if the lack of connection was the biggest issue we'd face out here. He glanced at me once, maybe twice, but barely registered I was even there. It used to bother me. Now it just confirmed what I already knew. The morning moved slowly. Breakfast stretched into late morning, and eventually plans were made. My mother and boyfriend decided to take a drive into town to look at shops. I declined. Said I needed rest. I wasn't lying, but that wasn't the whole truth either. When they left, I stood by the large front window, watching the car pull out of the long dirt driveway and disappear around the bend. Dust lingered in the air behind them like a cloud that didn't want to settle. He appeared beside me a moment later, holding 2 glasses of lemonade. I hadn't heard him approach. You planning to spend the day inside? He asked. Maybe. Seems like a waste. Want to sit outside for a while? I paused. The offer felt simple. Innocent, even. But I knew better. I said yes anyway. The patio was warm, the stones still holding heat from yesterday's sun. We sat in the shade, silence stretching comfortably between us. There was no urgency, no reason to talk. Just the low hum of the world around us, birds, wind, an occasional insect skimming the surface of the pool. Eventually, he started talking. About books, mostly. About a novel he'd reread recently and how it changed for him. You see things differently depending on where you are in life, he said. I asked what he meant, and he told me about a character who made a terrible decision, thinking it would bring freedom, only to find it brought more loneliness. He said when he read it younger, he blamed the character. Now, he understood him. That stayed with me. We spent the afternoon that way, talking in fragments, pausing for long silences, then picking up again. At one point, he asked about my job. I told him it was fine. That was the truth. Just fine. No passion, no excitement. Just hours and emails and meetings that blurred into each other. He asked if I ever thought about leaving. I said I had. But thinking about leaving and actually doing it were 2 very different things. Later, I went inside to grab something, a book I hadn't touched in weeks, and when I returned, he was standing near the edge of the patio, looking out over the horizon. The wind had picked up slightly, rustling the trees that dotted the property. I stood in the doorway for a moment, just watching him. He looked so still, so grounded. Like nothing could shake him. And yet, something about his posture told me otherwise. I joined him. Stood a little closer than necessary. He didn't move. Have you ever felt, I said quietly, like you were slowly drifting away from the person you're supposed to be? He looked at me then. Not just with his eyes, but all of him. Like the question mattered. Like it made sense. Every day, he said. We didn't speak after that. Not for a while. We just stood there, the silence pressing in, not heavy, but present. Later, when the sun had started to dip and the light turned soft and golden, we went for a walk down the trail behind the house. It wasn't planned. One of us just stood, and the other followed. We walked side by side, not touching, but not far apart either. The air was warm but pleasant. The path wound between small trees and brush, and the landscape opened up to reveal a view of the valley below. We stopped there, without a word, and looked out. I used to think, he said finally, that some feelings were safe as long as you didn't act on them. That you could feel something, recognize it, and then let it pass. I didn't say anything. My chest ached in a way I couldn't explain. But sometimes, he continued, the not acting becomes the lie. We stood there for another long moment. And then, we kissed. Nothing dramatic. No sudden music swelling in the background. Just the quiet meeting of two people who had crossed a line they couldn't uncross. There was no rush, no desperation. Just something quiet and devastatingly real. When we pulled apart, we didn't speak. We turned and started walking back. The sun had almost disappeared, and shadows stretched long across the dirt. Back at the house, the others weren't back yet. I went straight to my room, closed the door, and sat on the bed. My hands were shaking. Not from fear. Not even from guilt. But from knowing something had shifted permanently. No matter what happened next, I wouldn't be able to pretend anymore. The silence of the house surrounded me again, and this time, it felt like a witness. The following morning came slowly. I lay awake long before anyone else stirred, staring at the ceiling, trying to make sense of the night before. There was no undoing what had happened, no pretending it hadn't. And yet, part of me was still reaching for denial, as if I could go back to being the same person who had arrived in this house only a few days earlier. But I knew better. Something had shifted. It was subtle, like the first crack in a glass, barely visible, but irreversible. I got dressed quietly and slipped out onto the patio. The desert air was cool in the early light, the kind of crispness that hinted at heat to come. I wrapped my arms around myself, not from cold, but from the tension coiling inside me. The silence of the landscape felt heavier now. Before, it had been peaceful. Now it felt like it was waiting. Watching. Eventually, I heard the door slide open behind me. I didn't turn, but I knew it was him. His footsteps were unhurried, careful. He stood beside me without saying a word. We looked out over the same valley we had stood above the night before, but the air between us had changed. It wasn't tense. It wasn't relaxed. It just existed. Like something fragile that hadn't decided yet whether to break. Neither of us spoke. I didn't want to, and I sensed he didn't either. The silence between us had become a language of its own. Every breath, every shift in weight, every sideways glance was loaded with things we weren't ready to say. Maybe wouldn't ever say. He left first, heading back into the house. I stayed behind, letting the sun rise higher before I returned inside. My mother was already in the kitchen, humming to herself as she prepared breakfast. She looked up when I entered, smiling as if the world hadn't moved an inch. I poured myself coffee and leaned against the counter, nodding at whatever she was saying, something about a trail she wanted to explore that afternoon. My responses were automatic. Nods, short affirmations. I wasn't listening. I couldn't. My thoughts were elsewhere, tangled in the memory of yesterday, the weight of it pressing behind my eyes like a dull ache. My boyfriend entered the kitchen a few minutes later, rubbing sleep from his face, already scrolling on his phone. He barely looked at me. I wondered if he could sense something had changed. But if he did, he didn't show it. Maybe he didn't want to see. Maybe it was easier for him to keep playing the role we'd both quietly grown tired of. The day moved slowly, its rhythm dictated by my mother's cheerful plans. She insisted on taking all of us to the local market. The town was quaint, picturesque, with dusty streets and small artisan shops that looked like they belonged in another decade. I trailed behind the group, pretending to admire pottery and hand-woven baskets, but my mind was elsewhere. I watched him, even when I tried not to. The way he stood, the way he looked at the world, the way he didn't look at me. Every so often, our eyes met. Brief, unspoken acknowledgments. Not longing, not regret. Just recognition. We had crossed a line, and now we both carried it in our bodies like an echo. It didn't need to be repeated. It was already there, living in the silence. Back at the house, the mood shifted slightly. My mother was tired, my boyfriend distracted by work emails. Everyone scattered to their corners of the house. I wandered onto the patio again, needing space. The air was warmer now, heavier. I sat on the low wall that edged the patio and stared out, watching as shadows began to stretch across the landscape. He joined me again, later. I heard the door before I saw him. He didn't sit this time, just stood behind me. "We need to be careful," he said quietly. I didn't turn. I know. Neither of us offered more. It wasn't the kind of conversation that needed expansion. We both understood the weight of it. The reality. There was no plan, no future. Just a line that had been crossed and could never be uncrossed. The silence returned, thicker now. I felt his presence behind me, not threatening, but heavy. It filled the space between us with everything we weren't saying. Everything we didn't know how to say. Eventually, he turned and left. I stayed. I always stayed longer than I should. Sitting there in the silence, I wondered what it would be like if I just got up and walked away. If I packed a bag and left before anything else could fall apart. But I didn't. I wasn't ready. Dinner that night was quiet. My mother tried to fill the space with stories, laughter, questions that didn't require real answers. My boyfriend nodded along, barely contributing. I sat beside him, feeling the distance grow wider with every minute. And across the table, he sat in silence, eating slowly, never looking directly at me. After dinner, we cleared the table. My mother poured wine. My boyfriend disappeared into the bedroom with his laptop. I stood at the sink, washing dishes, when he came in behind me. I didn't turn. I could feel the tension radiating off him. "We can't do this again," he said, his voice low, but firm. I nodded. "Okay." He paused. "You don't sound convinced." I dried my hands and finally looked at him. "I don't know what I am." He studied me for a moment, then left the kitchen. The door slid shut behind him, leaving me alone with the sound of the faucet dripping. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling again. My boyfriend lay beside me, already asleep, turned away. I could hear his breathing, slow and even. I felt like a stranger in my own life. Like I'd stumbled into someone else's story and couldn't find my way out. I closed my eyes and tried to sleep. But my mind kept replaying the same few seconds, the walk, the view, the kiss. Not with longing. Not even with desire. But with the cold, clear certainty that I had changed. And nothing I did from now on could make me the same person I had been before. In the morning, we'd all wake up. We'd drink coffee and pretend the world hadn't shifted. But I knew it had. I could feel it in my bones. And that terrified me more than anything. The next morning unfolded with a kind of dull familiarity that felt both comforting and deceptive. I woke to the sound of birds outside the window, their calls echoing against the canyon walls, and for a moment, I let myself pretend that nothing had changed. That I was still the same person who had arrived here just days ago, carrying quiet discontent and a vague hope for rest. But the stillness inside me had long been replaced by a low, constant tension. Something had shifted, and there was no unknowing it. The house was already alive with motion. I could hear my mother moving around in the kitchen, the rhythmic clatter of dishes as she prepared breakfast. My boyfriend's voice filtered in from the patio, on another work call, talking about numbers and deadlines that had nothing to do with this place or what was happening within it. I stayed in bed a little longer, not quite ready to step back into the constructed version of myself that I knew they expected to see. The version that smiled, nodded, answered questions with enough enthusiasm to pass as present. I could still wear that mask, but each time it felt thinner, more brittle. Like it would crack if anyone looked too closely. Eventually, I forced myself up, showered, dressed, and made my way to the kitchen. My mother greeted me with her usual cheerfulness, handing me a plate as she recounted her plans for the day. She wanted us all to go hiking, a trail she'd read about in a local magazine, supposedly with breathtaking views. I nodded along, agreeing to whatever she suggested, even though my body already felt exhausted from carrying secrets that hadn't been spoken aloud. He entered the room not long after, his presence filling the space in a way I could no longer ignore. He was dressed casually, like the rest of us, but everything about him seemed more composed, more deliberate. He said good morning to everyone, poured himself coffee, and stood at the counter next to me. Our arms didn't touch, but the space between us felt impossibly charged. We didn't speak. We didn't need to. Every glance, every shift in posture, was a conversation neither of us dared to have out loud. My mother, oblivious to the undercurrent, continued chattering about water bottles, sunscreen, and the best time to leave. The hike began mid-morning. The trailhead wasn't far, maybe 20 minutes from the house, and the path itself was manageable. Dusty switchbacks cut through scrub brush and red rock, leading up to a wide overlook. The heat built steadily as we climbed, and conversation faded into labored breaths and the crunch of gravel underfoot. My mother led the way, determined and enthusiastic. My boyfriend trailed behind, stopping often to check his phone despite the spotty signal. That left me and him walking somewhere in the middle, a few paces apart, not close enough to draw attention, but close enough to feel the weight of each other's presence. I kept my eyes on the trail, focused on the rhythm of my steps, but my mind wandered. I thought about how things had unfolded, not suddenly, but gradually. Like water slowly wearing away at stone. I hadn't planned for any of it. I hadn't even seen it coming. But now, everything felt different. Even the air. At the top, we paused to take in the view. The valley stretched out below us, endless and vast. The silence was expansive, interrupted only by the occasional gust of wind. My mother took pictures, asking us all to pose, trying to capture something that didn't exist anymore. When she handed the phone to him and asked him to take a photo of me and my boyfriend, I hesitated. But I forced a smile, leaned into the familiar shape of someone I no longer truly touched, and stared into the lens. He snapped the photo without comment, handed the phone back, and turned away. The descent was quieter. Everyone was tired, sweaty, distracted. I walked alone, needing space, needing to feel the ground beneath my feet without anyone watching. When we returned to the car, I offered to sit in the back, letting my mother and boyfriend take the front seats. He sat beside me, and for most of the drive, we didn't speak. But somewhere near the house, when the road narrowed and the trees grew closer, he leaned slightly toward me and said, just loud enough for me to hear, "You looked like a stranger up there." I didn't respond. I didn't have words for what I felt in that moment, not shame, not guilt, but something harder to name. Something closer to mourning. Back at the house, the day dissolved into rest. My mother took a nap. My boyfriend disappeared into the guest room with his laptop again. I sat in the living room, pretending to read, the book heavy in my lap. He entered at some point, stood in the doorway for a moment, then walked past me to the kitchen. I heard him filling a glass with water, heard the clink of ice, the sigh that escaped him when he leaned against the counter. I thought I could stay away from this, he said finally, not looking at me. But I can't. I closed the book slowly, careful not to meet his gaze. Neither can I. Silence filled the space between us, not empty, but full of every consequence we were trying to ignore. He left without another word. That evening, we all sat down to dinner again. My mother had cooked something elaborate. She always did when she was trying to hold everyone together. My boyfriend talked more than usual, maybe trying to compensate for the growing distance he couldn't explain. I nodded, smiled, laughed in the right places. He sat across from me, eating quietly, his eyes avoiding mine. Later, when the table was cleared and the wine glasses rinsed, I went outside. The air had cooled, the wind carrying the scent of dust and pine. I stood at the edge of the patio, staring into the dark, trying to quiet the noise in my head. He joined me a few minutes later. This time, he stood close enough that our arms brushed. "We can't keep doing this," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I know." But neither of us moved. The silence returned, wrapping around us like a blanket we couldn't shake off. I didn't know what we were anymore. I didn't know what I was. But I knew the moment was growing too big to contain. And eventually, something would have to break. I just didn't know when. The days had started to blur together. Mornings passed in the same quiet routines, coffee in the kitchen, half-hearted plans, polite conversations that avoided anything real. The sun rose and set with mechanical precision, but time felt heavier, more complicated. Each hour brought with it the weight of what had already happened, and the tension of what hadn't yet. That morning, I found myself waking before everyone else again. I couldn't remember the last time I'd slept through the night without interruptions, restless dreams, shallow breathing, my mind spinning through every glance, every unspoken moment. I lay there for a few minutes, staring at the ceiling, the faint light of dawn slowly painting the walls in soft blue tones. The house was still. Silent. I moved quietly, dressed, and slipped outside, drawn once again to the patio that had become both refuge and trap. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of earth and stone. I wrapped my arms around myself, sitting on the same low wall where we had spoken just days before. My thoughts weren't organized. They came in waves, sharp, overlapping, unresolved. I heard the sliding door open behind me, but I didn't turn. I knew it was him. His presence had a weight I recognized now, like the subtle pressure of wind before a storm. He sat beside me without a word, close but not touching. We watched the horizon together, both pretending the silence was peaceful, even though we knew better. Eventually, he said, "She wants to go into town today." "All of us." I nodded slowly. "She mentioned it." Neither of us said more. There was nothing left to clarify. Every word felt dangerous, like it might unlock something neither of us could control. Later, my mother emerged from the house, lively and talkative, already dressed for the day. She announced her plan to visit a local artisan village, browse through galleries, maybe have lunch in a small cafe she had read about in a travel guide. She handed out suggestions like invitations, more hopeful than demanding. My boyfriend was reluctant, but agreed. I didn't protest. None of us did. The drive into town was quiet. I sat in the back seat, staring out the window, letting the landscape blur. The road wound through stretches of low trees and rocky terrain, sunlight cutting through in sharp streaks. My mother talked from the front seat about the weather, the shops, and new cafe she was eager to try. My boyfriend gave clipped responses, distracted as always. He drove. His eyes stayed on the road, hands steady on the wheel. He didn't speak much. Neither did I. In town, we wandered through narrow streets lined with handmade pottery, woven textiles, and faded signs that spoke of old stories and long-ago promises. My mother floated from shop to shop, charmed by everything. My boyfriend found a bench, pulled out his phone, and disconnected from us entirely. I drifted through the crowd, never straying too far, but never walking beside anyone either. I entered a small bookstore at one point, drawn to the cool air and the quiet. The shelves were packed tight, the floor creaked with every step. I ran my fingers over worn spines, not reading, just touching. Looking for something I couldn't name. He came in a few minutes later. I felt him before I saw him, the way the air shifted slightly. He didn't say anything, just stood beside me at a different shelf. We weren't hidden, not really, but no one was paying attention. No one ever really did. Our eyes met for the briefest moment, and I saw it there: uncertainty, longing, restraint. And something else. Something deeper. The quiet collapse of a boundary that had already begun to dissolve. Outside, my mother waved from across the square, calling us over to see something. We went, falling into place beside her like nothing had happened. Like we hadn't been standing in the silence of a bookstore, breathing the same tense air. Lunch was at a cafe with chipped tables and faded umbrellas. The food was simple. My mother talked endlessly, filling every silence with stories from her youth, from her travels, from a life she still believed we were all part of. My boyfriend barely looked up from his screen. I answered when prompted, smiled when appropriate. He sat across from me, silent. Our eyes didn't meet. Back at the house, the heat had settled into the walls. The afternoon felt long, stretched thin by the weight of everything unsaid. My mother lay down for a nap. My boyfriend retreated to the guest room again, headphones in, detached from the rest of us. I wandered the house, restless, not knowing where to place myself. I found him in the den, sitting in the armchair by the window, a book in his lap that he wasn't reading. I stood in the doorway for a moment before stepping in. He looked up, and something passed between us: recognition, resignation, need. I sat down on the edge of the couch. We were alone. The quiet between us wasn't peaceful. It was full. I keep thinking, I said softly, that if we just stay silent, maybe it'll all fade. His voice was low. It won't. We sat there for a long time. Not touching. Not moving. Just sitting in the thick quiet of a house that had become too small for everything it now contained. Later, after the sun had dipped low and the house grew dim, I stepped out onto the patio. The wind had picked up, brushing strands of hair across my face. I stood at the edge, hands gripping the railing, trying to slow the thoughts in my head. He came outside a few minutes later. He didn't speak. He just stood beside me. The silence returned, this time not quite as heavy. It wrapped around us, familiar now. I turned slightly to face him. We kissed. It wasn't urgent. It wasn't desperate. It was quiet, inevitable. A confirmation of everything we hadn't said. The moment lingered, suspended in the stillness of the evening. When it ended, we didn't speak. We didn't move. We just stood there, the wind brushing past us, the sky deepening above. Nothing had been fixed. Nothing had been decided. But in that moment, the silence finally made sense. The morning after the kiss was different. Not in appearance, everything looked the same. The desert was still stretching beyond the patio with its usual stillness, the light creeping into the house through tall windows in familiar golden beams. But something in the air had shifted. Heavier. Closer. More fragile. I awoke earlier than usual, my body refusing the comfort of sleep. I lay in bed for a while, eyes wide open, staring into the soft shadows above. My boyfriend was asleep beside me, turned toward the wall. His breath was even, calm. I watched his back rise and fall, but I felt no connection to the body lying next to mine. There was a time when waking up next to him brought safety, a kind of rhythm I could count on. That time had long passed. And now, instead of comfort, there was only distance. I slipped out of bed quietly, trying not to disturb him. My feet touched the cold floor with an almost ceremonial slowness. Every movement I made felt like it mattered too much. In the kitchen, my mother was already brewing coffee, humming to herself as if the world hadn't changed. She looked at me with her usual warmth, then began asking about the plans for the day. There were none, really. No excursions, no hikes, no markets. Just a slow day at the house. Rest, she said. Recharge. Her voice wrapped around those words like a ribbon, trying to dress them up as gifts. I nodded and mumbled agreement, then took my coffee out onto the patio. I needed the air. I needed distance from walls that suddenly felt too tight. The breeze was gentle, brushing past my arms like a whisper. I sat in the corner, the ceramic mug warm between my palms, and stared at the horizon, trying to focus on the line where land met sky. Trying to find something solid in it. He joined me a few minutes later, but sat a bit farther than usual. Not across the patio, but not beside me either. We didn't speak. We didn't even look at each other. But his presence was unmistakable, quiet and weighty. A question that hadn't been asked. My mother appeared not long after, interrupting the silence with soft chatter and a second cup of coffee. She stood between us, oblivious, gesturing toward the backyard and talking about trimming some plants near the stone path. Her voice was the same as always, light, practical, unaware. I watched her speak and felt a dull ache under my ribs. It wasn't guilt. Not entirely. It was more like mourning. Later in the morning, my boyfriend wandered in, already distracted by messages on his phone. He gave me a casual look, then turned to ask about breakfast. My mother happily volunteered to cook. The three of them headed inside, leaving me alone on the patio. I stayed there for a long time, barely moving. The sun rose higher, warming the tiles beneath my feet. I watched light crawl across the floorboards and tried to slow my breathing. Nothing about what had happened felt reckless. That was the strangest part. There was no heat of passion, no drama. It felt like inevitability, quiet and slow, like water eroding stone. Around midday, he passed by me again, this time on his way to the shed behind the house. He carried tools in his hands and didn't look up. But his body language was tight, guarded. I wondered what was running through his mind, whether he was replaying the same moments or pushing them away, burying them under layers of practicality and silence. My boyfriend suggested we drive into town again, just the two of us. Just to get out of the house, he said. I hesitated, unsure if I had the energy to wear that version of myself again. But I agreed. It seemed easier than declining. The drive was quiet at first. He kept the windows down, letting the warm air move through the car. At one point, he asked if everything was okay. I said yes. He nodded but didn't believe me. I could feel it in his posture, in the way his fingers tightened around the steering wheel. We stopped at a small store on the edge of town. He went inside to look for snacks. I stayed in the car. Through the window, I watched families walking past, couples holding hands, a group of teenagers laughing near the corner. Their ease felt foreign, unreachable. When we returned, the house was still. My mother had gone out for a walk, according to the note she left on the counter. He was nowhere to be seen. My boyfriend went into the bedroom to take a call, closing the door behind him without a word. I stood in the kitchen for a while, not knowing what to do with myself. My hands moved on autopilot, tidying dishes, wiping counters, folding a towel. Tasks that didn't need doing, but kept me upright. Eventually, I walked down the hall and stopped in front of the den. The door was half open. He was inside, seated at the desk, flipping through a book without reading it. I hesitated, then knocked gently on the doorframe. He looked up, but didn't speak. I wanted to talk, I said. He set the book down. His eyes were tired, guarded. About what? I stepped inside. The room felt cooler than the rest of the house, shaded and still. I don't know, I admitted. About what this is. About what we're doing. He ran a hand through his hair and leaned back in the chair. I don't think either of us knows what we're doing. We sat there for a moment, the silence filling in the spaces between sentences. He stood and walked to the window, staring out at the dry earth and scattered trees. This doesn't lead anywhere good, he said finally. I nodded. I know. But that doesn't mean I can stop thinking about it. The honesty in his voice cut through me. It wasn't romantic. It wasn't even tender. It was just the truth, stripped down to its raw core. We didn't touch. We didn't move closer. But in that moment, something settled between us. Not resolution. Not closure. Just understanding. Dinner that night was awkward. My mother seemed tired, distracted. My boyfriend was quiet. I tried to hold myself together, to keep my responses neutral, but I felt brittle, like any wrong word would shatter the illusion we were still all okay. After dinner, I excused myself early. I went to my room, closed the door, and sat on the floor beside the bed, knees pulled to my chest. The room was dim, and outside the window, the wind had picked up, rustling the branches and brushing against the walls like fingers searching for a way in. I stayed there for a long time, listening to the house. Listening for footsteps, for voices, for anything that might break the stillness. But the silence held. And in that silence, I realized something I hadn't before. This wasn't just about a kiss, or a moment, or even a mistake. This was about the spaces between people. The ones we don't talk about. The ones we live inside without realizing until we've wandered too far to find the way back. And maybe that was the most dangerous part. Not the crossing of the line, but the quiet, unnoticed drift toward it. The morning after our conversation in the den, I woke with a sense of inevitability settled deep in my chest. The kind of weight that doesn't come from one moment but from the slow accumulation of all the moments before it. Outside the window, the sky was overcast, unusual for this part of the desert. It cast a soft, diffused light over the room, making everything look faded, worn. My boyfriend was already up. I could hear his voice from the next room, low and professional, speaking into his phone with the tone he reserved for clients. I stayed in bed a little longer, watching the shadows shift across the ceiling. I didn't feel rested. I hadn't felt truly rested in days. My body ached from too much stillness, and my mind was a constant loop of words I couldn't say aloud. When I finally got up and stepped into the hallway, the house felt unusually silent. My mother's bedroom door was open, the bed made. I assumed she was already out on one of her morning walks. She had taken to disappearing early, claiming it helped her clear her mind. I sometimes wondered what she was trying to clear it of. In the kitchen, the coffee pot was still warm. I poured myself a cup and sat at the table, cradling it in my hands, letting the heat seep into my skin. I watched the steam curl upward and tried to keep my breathing steady. The silence felt fragile, like a glass surface stretched too thin. He entered the room a few minutes later. I didn't look up, but I felt his presence like I always did. He poured himself coffee and leaned against the counter. For a while, neither of us spoke. The only sound was the soft clink of ceramic on tile. "She wants to go into town again," he said finally. I nodded without lifting my gaze. I figured. She wants to have lunch. Just the three of us. That caught my attention. I looked up. Not him? He shook his head. She said he looked tired. I didn't know what to say to that. The thought of sitting across from her, pretending to be whole, felt impossible. And yet, I knew I'd do it. That was the role I had taken on the moment we arrived. Dutiful daughter. Patient partner. Ghost of myself. The rest of the morning passed in pieces. My mother returned, cheerful as ever, talking about wildflowers and the smell of rain on the path. She barely paused to breathe between sentences. My boyfriend disappeared into his room again, and I pretended not to care. When it came time to leave for lunch, I sat in the back seat again. My mother drove, chatting with him in the passenger seat about a small bistro she'd read about online. I stared out the window, watching the landscape slip past, trying to anchor myself in the present moment. But my thoughts kept drifting back to the kiss, the conversations, the unraveling. The bistro was quiet, tucked away behind a row of antique shops. The kind of place that made you feel like time had slowed down. My mother chose a table by the window, and we followed. She ordered wine, smiled at the server, and filled the silence with light stories. We nodded and smiled in all the right places. But beneath the table, I could feel the tension pulsing between us. Not visible, not loud. Just present. When our eyes met, it was brief. Cautious. We both knew we were approaching something we couldn't avoid. After lunch, we walked along the storefronts. My mother lingered in a boutique, trying on scarves and asking for opinions neither of us were capable of giving. I stood near the door, arms crossed, eyes on the sidewalk. He came to stand beside me, his voice low. She's starting to sense it. I didn't respond right away. You think so? She knows something's off. She's too quiet when we get back. Like she's waiting for something to surface. I didn't know how to respond to that. There was a part of me that wanted it all to come out, just to stop living in the tension. But another part still clung to the illusion, fragile as it was. Back at the house, my boyfriend was asleep on the couch, a movie playing quietly in the background. My mother disappeared into her room with a book and a cup of tea. The house returned to its usual rhythm, quiet, subdued, heavy. That evening, the sky turned a strange shade of orange. The sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the patio. I stood at the edge, watching the horizon, letting the wind lift my hair from my shoulders. He joined me as the last light faded. We stood side by side, the silence between us different now, less charged, more resigned. We can't keep doing this, he said. I know. But I don't want to leave it like this. I don't either. The honesty was painful. Raw. We weren't trying to romanticize anything. There was no poetry in this. Only two people who had found something too late and too wrong. I don't know what happens next, I said. Neither do I. There was nothing more to say. We stood there a little longer, watching the night arrive. Later, when the house was quiet and everyone had gone to bed, I stood in the hallway outside his room. I didn't knock. I didn't call his name. I just stood there, listening to the faint hum of the ceiling fan, the shifting of blankets, the distant creak of the house settling into sleep. And then, I stepped inside. We spent the night together. Morning arrived slowly, dragging the weight of the night with it. I lay in bed, eyes wide open, the ceiling above me unfamiliar yet unchanged. Outside, the light filtered through the curtains in soft, hesitant streaks, as if the day itself wasn't sure it should begin. The silence of the house was deeper than before, not peaceful but watchful. Every creak in the walls, every subtle shift in the air felt magnified. I didn't move at first. My body was still, not out of fear or guilt, but something harder to name, something that sat between regret and inevitability. The room was filled with the echoes of a choice I couldn't take back, and for the first time since we'd arrived in Sedona, I couldn't pretend not to feel the consequences curling around my throat. When I finally got up, the hallway was empty. The house was quiet in that strange way that suggests presence more than absence, as if someone had just left the room a moment ago. I passed my mother's door, which was closed. The light beneath it was faint. I kept walking. In the kitchen, there was a note on the counter in her handwriting. Went for a walk. Needed to clear my head. The words looked harmless, ordinary. But the spacing of the letters was tight, as if written with a clenched jaw. She had written something like this before, but never quite like this. I stood there for a long time, reading it over and over, as if it might rewrite itself. He walked in a few minutes later. I didn't turn. I heard the sound of his footsteps pause just behind me. Then the quiet clink of a mug, the trickle of coffee being poured. She saw something, I said, without looking at him. There was a pause. You think so? I know so. Silence stretched again, thick and heavy. She didn't say anything. She wouldn't. Not yet. I finally turned to face him. He looked tired, more than I'd seen before. Not just physically, but somewhere deeper. The way a person looks when they know the ground beneath them is starting to give way. What now? I asked, not expecting an answer. He shook his head. We wait, I guess. But waiting felt unbearable. Throughout the day, the house felt different. Each room carried a new kind of stillness, like it was holding its breath. My boyfriend had gone out early, saying he needed to check emails in town. It was just an excuse, of course. Distance was easier for him than confrontation. He could feel something was unraveling, but he didn't want to know what. I spent most of the morning alone on the patio. I didn't read. I didn't write. I just sat, letting the hours pass across my skin like sunlight, warm at first, then burning. I replayed every moment that had led to this point, searching for something I missed, a place I could have stopped it. But there wasn't one. Not really. It hadn't started with a decision. It had started with an ache. He joined me briefly around noon. We didn't say much. A few words about the heat, about the grocery list, about nothing. We didn't look at each other for more than a second at a time. And yet, every movement, every breath, felt louder than any conversation. I'm leaving tonight, he said eventually. I blinked. Where? Back home. I need space. It made sense. And it didn't. I didn't ask for more. Later that afternoon, my mother returned. Her presence filled the house differently now, quieter, more measured. She said little, moved deliberately. She didn't ask where I'd been or what I'd done that day. She didn't ask where he was. She just moved around me like someone walking carefully across cracked glass. Dinner was silent. The four of us sat around the table as if we were strangers forced to share a meal. My mother served the food, but barely touched hers. My boyfriend asked about the weather, then said nothing more. I nodded and chewed and swallowed and counted the minutes until it was over. When it was, she stood up first. She gathered the plates, moved to the sink, started washing without saying a word. I joined her. We didn't speak. The sound of water running filled the space between us. She passed me a wet plate, and I dried it. Then another. Finally, she said, "You're not yourself." I didn't answer. She continued, voice low, steady. I've seen it before. In women who are about to do something they can't take back. Or already have. My hand froze on the plate. She didn't look at me. I'm not angry, she said. Not yet. But I'm not blind. I wanted to speak, to explain, to defend something, anything. But nothing came. My mouth opened and closed around silence. When the dishes were done, she walked away without another word. I stayed behind, my hands damp, my heart louder than it had been in days. That night, after everyone had gone to bed, I sat on the patio alone. The stars above were painfully bright, indifferent. The desert stretched endlessly, offering no comfort. I thought about leaving, just walking into the night and not turning back. Instead, I stood and returned to the hallway. He was already at the door, suitcase beside him. We stood facing each other, both too tired to pretend. "This isn't how I wanted it to end," he said. "Then how did you want it to end?" He didn't answer. He picked up the suitcase. I opened the door for him. Neither of us looked back. The house felt hollow the next morning, as if something essential had been removed in the night and left a vacuum in its place. I woke to a silence that wasn't peaceful, but sterile, like sound itself was too cautious to enter. I didn't know if my mother had slept. Her door was still closed, but the light beneath it was gone. My boyfriend had left earlier than usual, a note on the counter saying he needed to catch up on work. I didn't believe it, but I didn't challenge it either. At this point, avoidance was the only language we shared. I stood in the kitchen, holding a cup of coffee I hadn't yet sipped, staring through the window at the hazy outline of the mountains in the distance. The sky was cloudless, but the air felt thick. The kind of weight that settles in your lungs and doesn't let you exhale all the way. I thought about how endings rarely came in loud, dramatic ways. How they more often unfolded in increments, a glance, a breath, a silence that stretched too long. Last night hadn't been a conclusion. It had been an unraveling finally reaching its quiet edge. When my mother entered the room, she moved with a stillness that wasn't fatigue. It was focus. She didn't look at me. She didn't need to. "I want to talk," she said, her voice even. I nodded. "Okay." She gestured toward the patio. I followed her outside, the warm stone beneath my feet grounding me even as I felt like I was floating just above myself. We sat at the table, the same one where we'd had coffee and small talk only days ago. Everything looked the same. Nothing was. She stared straight ahead for a long moment. Then, calmly, "How long?" I didn't respond immediately. There was no point in pretending she didn't know. "A few days," I said finally. She nodded once, slowly. Was it worth it? That question landed harder than I expected. Not because I didn't have an answer, but because I had too many. And none of them could change what had already happened. "I don't know," I said. She didn't respond. The silence between us was different now, not avoidance, but consequence. "I wasn't blind," she said after a while. "I just didn't want to see it." I kept my eyes on the table. The grain in the wood, the tiny scratch near the edge, the ring left by a forgotten glass, every detail seemed louder than the conversation itself. "I don't know who I'm angrier at," she continued. "You, or myself." There was nothing I could say to that. No apology that could stitch together what had already torn. I wanted to reach for her, but my arms felt heavy, useless. "He left?" she asked. I nodded. "Good." Her tone didn't have spite. Just resolution. We sat there for a long time. No raised voices, no tears. Just two people surrounded by a silence they had both helped create. Eventually, she stood. "I need time. I need space." "I think you do too." I looked up at her for the first time. Her eyes were tired, but steady. She wasn't falling apart. She was choosing what remained of herself and walking forward. "I'm going home early," she said. "You should figure out what you want to do." Then she walked back inside, leaving me on the patio with the coffee gone cold. The rest of the day moved in fragments. My boyfriend returned briefly in the afternoon, acting as though nothing had shifted. I watched him from across the room, realizing we were no longer part of the same story. Maybe we never had been. We had just held on to the idea of each other out of habit, out of fear of being alone. But we had been alone for a long time already, just side by side. He asked if I wanted to go for dinner, somewhere in town. I declined. He nodded, no argument, and left again. His exits had become easier than his presence. By early evening, my mother had packed most of her things. She moved through the house with quiet determination. I offered to help. She shook her head. "This is mine to carry," she said, almost softly. When she was done, she stood at the door with her bag and keys. I met her there, unsure of what to say. "I don't hate you," she said. "But I can't look at you right now." I nodded, accepting it. "I don't know what happens next," I said. "None of us do." Then she left. And the house was empty in a way I hadn't known it could be. Not just quiet, but empty. I wandered the rooms for a while, touching things as I passed them, door frames, furniture, picture frames, like I needed to confirm I was still here. Still real. Every corner carried echoes of conversations, of silence, of glances that meant too much. That night, I didn't eat. I didn't turn on the lights. I sat on the floor of the living room, knees drawn to my chest, watching the sky outside darken from soft lavender to deep black. I felt suspended in time, like the version of me who had arrived here was gone, and the one who would leave hadn't yet decided who she would become. I thought about writing. About trying to make sense of things in words. But even the idea felt too neat. Too controlled. So I just sat there. And for the first time in a long while, I let everything catch up to me. The grief. The guilt. The loss. The strange, unwelcome freedom. I had chosen something. Not consciously, maybe. But I had chosen it. And now I had to carry it. Alone. The morning I left Sedona was quieter than any that came before it. Not just in sound, but in presence. The house was stripped of voices, of footsteps, of the tension that had once filled every room like smoke. It was still furnished, still sunlit, but it felt hollow, like the shell of a story that had already ended. I moved through it slowly, as if I was walking through a museum of something that no longer belonged to me. I had spent the night on the couch, not because I couldn't sleep in the bed, but because I didn't want to. That room had held too many versions of me, some I no longer recognized. I lay there for hours, not quite asleep, not fully awake, listening to the silence press against the windows and walls. I didn't cry. There was no catharsis. Just a stillness that settled so deeply into my bones it felt like I would carry it forever. By sunrise, I was already dressed and packed. There wasn't much to take, just a few clothes, a notebook, a charger. I left behind the books I had brought, the sandals by the door, the scarf I had worn on the first day. None of it felt like mine anymore. Before locking up, I walked through the house one last time. The kitchen, where laughter once echoed off tile. The patio, where every silence had felt like a conversation. The hallway, where footsteps had once meant anticipation. Now they meant absence. In my room, I paused by the dresser. There was a photo tucked into the edge of the mirror, one my mother had placed there at some point during the trip. The three of us. Smiling. Pretense preserved in glossy print. I didn't take it. I didn't touch it. I just looked at it for a few moments and walked away. The car felt too quiet on the drive out of Sedona. The engine's hum was the only sound, and even that felt muted. The road wound through the red rocks and hills like a memory I couldn't shake. Every turn reminded me of a conversation, a glance, a thought I hadn't said aloud. I didn't know where I was going at first. I just knew I couldn't stay. Not in that house. Not in that version of myself. I ended up in a small town 2 hours south, one with quiet streets and too many antique shops. I found a motel that didn't ask questions, paid for 3 nights in advance, and carried my small bag into a room that smelled faintly of lavender and old carpet. The walls were beige. The lamp flickered when turned on. But it was quiet. And it was mine, for now. I spent the first day doing almost nothing. I sat by the window and watched the parking lot. I walked to a small cafe nearby and ordered a sandwich I didn't finish. I wrote a single sentence in my notebook and then crossed it out. My body was still moving, but everything inside felt like it had stopped. By the second day, the silence began to stretch too far. I opened my laptop and stared at the blank screen. I thought about calling someone, anyone, but realized I had nothing to say that wouldn't be met with confusion or pity. I thought about my mother. I imagined her back home, in the house she had built, folding laundry or watering plants or sitting alone with a cup of tea. I wondered if she thought about me, and if she did, whether it hurt or burned or just settled into her like dust. I didn't call her. Instead, I wrote a letter I never intended to send. I filled the page with apologies, with explanations, with sentences that wound around themselves until they dissolved into nothing. I tried to be honest. Not just with her, but with myself. I wrote about the loneliness that had grown in me for years, unnoticed. About the way I had started to disappear into silence long before Sedona. About how the attention I had found wasn't about love or desire, but recognition. And how recognition, once given, was nearly impossible to unsee. I folded the letter and placed it in the back of my notebook. That night, I walked through town without purpose. The shops were closed. The lights dimmed. I passed strangers who didn't look at me, and I was grateful for that. I didn't want to be seen. Not yet. Maybe not for a while. Back at the motel, I stood outside my door for a long time before going in. I watched the sky above, cloudless, vast, untouched. The same sky that had hung over everything. It hadn't changed. Only I had. On the third morning, I checked out. I didn't go home. Not yet. I drove toward the coast, not thinking about the destination, only the direction. I passed towns I didn't know the names of, gas stations with blinking signs, long stretches of nothing but earth and road. Eventually, I stopped at a lookout point where the ocean met the sky in a seamless horizon. I stepped out of the car and let the wind hit me full in the face. It was cold. Sharp. It reminded me I was still here. Still breathing. I stood there for a long time. No thoughts. No conclusions. Just presence. The kind I hadn't felt in months. Maybe longer. And when I got back in the car, I whispered aloud, not to anyone, not as a prayer, but as a promise I barely believed, I'll figure it out. Because I had to. Because I had no choice. Because even if I had ruined everything, I was still here. And that had to mean something.